Stay low. Under the bench. Do not come out until I say.
Snow lashed against the frosted glass of the Denver Pacific locomotive as Abigail Prescott hid her tear-stained face behind a tattered wool shawl. Disgraced, penniless, and abandoned by a swindler, her ruined life seemed completely over until a rugged stranger in blood-stained buckskins deliberately claimed the empty seat beside her. Denver, in the winter of 1883, was an unforgiving metropolis of mud, smoke, and shattered dreams, and Abigail Prescott felt the weight of every broken promise pressing down on her shoulders. She sat huddled in the rearmost passenger car of the narrow-gauge train bound for Leadville, trying to make herself as small as humanly possible. Her dark blue traveling dress, once the height of Denver fashion, was now stained with soot and rain, its hem frayed from 3 days of wandering the boarding houses of Larimer Street. She was heading home in absolute crushing shame. 6 months prior, Abigail had been the darling of Leadville's high society. As the only daughter of Judge William Prescott, she had enjoyed a life insulated by wealth and strict Victorian respectability. But she had thrown it all away for Charles Beaumont. Charles, with his tailored Eastern suits, his smooth baritone voice, and his promises of a vast silver strike in Nevada, had swept her off her feet. He had convinced her to elope, whispering that her father would never understand true enterprise. Blinded by romantic rebellion, Abigail had stolen the deed to her late mother's estate to help fund Charles's mining operation, fleeing into the night. 3 days ago, she had woken up in a cheap Denver hotel to find Charles gone. He had taken the deed, the remaining cash, and even the gold locket her grandmother had given her. The police had laughed at her. Charles Beaumont, they revealed, was actually a known confidence man named Arthur Penhaligon, wanted in 3 territories for fraud. Now, holding a ticket purchased with the last silver dollar she had found at the bottom of her carpetbag, Abigail was returning to the father she had betrayed. She held a telegram in her gloved hands, its words burned into her memory. "You may return. You will reside in the servants' quarters until your debt is paid. Your folly is your own." The passenger car was suffocatingly crowded. Sweaty silver miners, drummers selling patent medicines, and exhausted families crammed into the narrow wooden benches. Yet, the seat beside Abigail remained miraculously empty. The draft from the rear door was biting, and perhaps it was the sheer aura of misery radiating from her that kept others at bay. She turned her face toward the frosted window, watching the platform, praying for the train to lurch forward so she could officially begin her descent into purgatory. Then, the rear door of the car slammed open, letting in a howling gust of icy wind and a man who looked as though he had birthed the storm himself. The chatter in the railcar died instantly. Even the hardened miners shrank back into their seats. The man who stepped inside was massive, standing well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders practically brushing the brass lamps hanging from the ceiling. He was a mountain man, a relic of a bygone era of the frontier. He wore a heavy buffalo hide coat that was scored with claw marks and fringed buckskins that smelled sharply of wood smoke, pine resin, and raw earth. A thick, untamed beard obscured the lower half of his face, peppered with premature streaks of gray, and a scarred leather slouch hat was pulled low over his eyes. In one hand, he carried a battered Winchester rifle. Strapped to his thigh was a heavy Colt revolver, and a hunting knife with an elk antler handle rested at his belt. His boots were heavy, snow-caked leather. He paused at the back of the car, his piercing slate-gray eyes scanning the occupants with the cold, calculating gaze of an apex predator. Abigail held her breath, pressing herself against the window. Surely he would move up to the front, where the stove radiated a meager amount of heat. Instead, the mountain man's gaze locked onto the empty space beside her. He moved down the narrow aisle with surprising grace for a man of his size, his heavy boots making barely a sound. He stopped beside her row. He didn't ask if the seat was taken. He simply unslung a heavy canvas pack, tossed it onto the overhead rack with a grunt of exertion, and sat down. The bench groaned in protest. He took up far more than his half of the seat, his massive shoulders crowding Abigail. The smell of him was overwhelming, not unpleasant, but entirely wild. It was the scent of ozone before a lightning strike, of crushed pine needles, and the musky tang of oiled leather. Abigail kept her eyes glued to the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She dared not look at him. She tightened her tattered shawl around her trembling shoulders, fighting a sudden, humiliating urge to weep. She was so cold, so hungry, and so profoundly alone. For a long time, neither spoke. The locomotive gave a shrill whistle, steam hissing violently, and the train lurched forward, beginning its slow, arduous climb into the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. As the train gained altitude, the temperature in the rear car plummeted. Frost began to creep across the inside of the glass. Abigail's teeth began to chatter, a sound she desperately tried to suppress by biting down on her lower lip until she tasted copper. A sudden, heavy weight descended over her. Abigail gasped, flinching violently. She turned, expecting hostility, only to find that the mountain man had draped a thick, remarkably soft pelt wolf, perhaps, or coyote over her shoulders. She stared up at him, her eyes wide with shock. Up close, the rugged landscape of his face was even more intimidating. A jagged white scar ran through his left eyebrow, disappearing into his hairline. Yet, his slate-gray eyes held no malice, only a quiet, grounded observation. "You're shaking enough to rattle the bolts out of the floorboards," he said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble, like boulders shifting at the bottom of a riverbed. I am fine, thank you," Abigail stammered, her voice raspy from days of crying. She reached up to push the pelt away, mindful of proper propriety, even in her disgraced state. His large calloused hand shot out, catching her wrist. His grip was entirely gentle, but as unyielding as iron. "Pride doesn't keep the blood warm, lady. Keep it." He released her wrist and leaned back, pulling his slouch hat down over his eyes, effectively ending the conversation. Abigail sat frozen for a moment, the heavy pelt radiating a glorious, life-saving heat. Slowly, she pulled it tighter around herself, a single tear escaping her eye and rolling down her cheek. It was the first act of kindness she had experienced since Charles had vanished into the Denver night. "Thank you," she whispered into the fur. The mountain man gave a barely perceptible nod, adjusting his Winchester rifle so it rested comfortably across his knees. "Name's Caleb," he muttered from beneath his hat. "Caleb Hayes." "Abigail," she replied softly, offering no surname. She felt she no longer had the right to one. As the train plunged deeper into the snow-choked canyons, carrying her back to a life of servitude and scorn, Abigail closed her eyes, entirely unaware that the man beside her was the only thing standing between her and a rapidly approaching nightmare. 4 hours into the journey, the Denver Pacific train ground to a shuddering halt at a remote water tower near Georgetown. The blizzard outside had intensified into a blinding whiteout, burying the tracks and forcing the locomotive to pause and build up steam. Inside the rear car, the passengers huddled together, blowing into their cupped hands, their breath pluming in the freezing air. Abigail had fallen into a fitful, exhausted sleep under the warmth of Caleb's pelt. She woke with a start as the heavy iron doors at the front of the car banged open. 2 men stepped inside, shaking snow from their heavy canvas dusters. They didn't look like passengers, nor did they look like railroad employees. They moved with a predatory swagger, their eyes systematically scanning the rows of huddled travelers. The first man was tall and gaunt, with pockmarked skin and a bowler hat. The second was shorter, barrel-chested, with a broken nose that gave him a permanent, ugly sneer. Abigail's blood ran cold. She recognized the gaunt man. She had seen him talking to Charles in the lobby of the Denver hotel just a day before Charles had abandoned her. Charles had introduced him as a business associate named Mr. Shaw, but Abigail had noticed the heavy bulge of a shoulder holster beneath the man's coat. Thaddeus Shaw was no business associate. He was a Pinkerton detective turned ruthless bounty hunter, currently in the employ of the Nevada bank that Charles had defrauded weeks before meeting Abigail. Shaw's cold eyes swept over the car, finally locking onto the back row. He nudged his barrel-chested companion, a hired thug named Boyd Higgins, and the two began a slow, deliberate walk down the aisle. Panic seized Abigail's chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She pressed back against the wooden seat, frantically looking for a way out. There was none. The rear door was frozen shut, and the aisle was blocked by the approaching men. "Well, well, well," Shaw drawled as he reached their row. He leaned casually against the wooden bench in front of them, pushing his bowler hat back. "If it isn't the lovely Mrs. Beaumont, or should I say, Miss Prescott." Abigail couldn't find her voice. She pulled the fur pelt up to her chin, trembling violently. "Your husband left quite a mess back in Denver, Miss Prescott," Shaw continued, keeping his voice deceptively low. "Left us holding the bag, as it were, but he was careless. He mentioned you were heading back to Leadville. We figure a smart girl like you didn't just let him run off with all that cash. We figure you're holding on to the bank drafts. Maybe the deed to that estate, too." "I don't know what you're talking about," Abigail whispered, her voice cracking. "He took everything. He left me with nothing." Higgins scoffed, taking a step closer, his hand resting on the butt of the revolver at his hip. "Don't play coy, sweetheart. We're going to take your bag, and then we're going to take you off this train. You're going to help us find him, or you're going to pay off his debt yourself." Higgins reached out, grabbing Abigail's upper arm with a bruising grip to haul her to her feet. Before Abigail could even scream, a sound like a thunderclap shattered the tense quiet of the back row. It was the metallic, unmistakable snick-clack of a lever-action rifle chambering around. Higgins froze. He slowly looked down. The barrel of Caleb Hayes's Winchester was pressed firmly against Higgins's heavy stomach. Caleb hadn't stood up. He hadn't even pushed his hat back from his eyes. He sat perfectly still, but the sudden, lethal tension radiating from his massive frame made the air in the car feel suffocatingly thin. "The lady is resting," Caleb said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that barely carried over the howling wind outside. "Take your hand off her. Now." Shaw stiffened, his eyes darting to the mountain man. He tried to put on a mask of authority. "Stay out of this, Trapper. This is official business. This woman is an accomplice to grand larceny. We're taking her in." "I said," Caleb repeated, the words dripping with glacial danger. "Take the hand off." Higgins looked at Shaw, then back down to the rifle barrel pressing into his gut. Slowly, carefully, he released Abigail's arm and took a half-step back. Caleb finally shifted. He pushed his slouch hat up with the thumb of his free hand, fixing Shaw with a stare so hard it could have cracked flint. "I know who you are, Thaddeus Shaw. I know you got kicked out of the Pinkertons 2 years ago for beating a suspect to death in Omaha. You ain't carrying a badge that matters anywhere west of the Mississippi." Shaw's eyes widened slightly in recognition, then narrowed into slits of pure venom. "Who the hell are you?" "Nobody you want to cross in a closed rail car," Caleb replied evenly. "You boys are hunting Arthur Penhaligon. Good luck to you. But you're barking up the wrong tree here. She's a victim, same as the bank. She's got no money, no deeds, and she's under my protection until she steps off this train in Leadville. You so much as look at her sideways again, and I'll feed you to the wolves out there, piece by piece." The silence that followed was heavy and fraught with violence. The other passengers in the nearby seats had turned away, aggressively pretending not to witness the standoff. Shaw calculated the odds. A tight space, a giant of a man with a cocked rifle, and nothing to gain if he ended up bleeding out on the floorboards. He shot a venomous glare at Abigail. "This isn't over, Miss Prescott," Shaw hissed. "Penhaligon owes a lot of dangerous men. You think Daddy's money in Leadville is going to keep you safe? They'll find you." He signaled to Higgins with a jerk of his head. The two men slowly backed away, retreating up the aisle and disappearing into the forward car, slamming the iron door shut behind them. Abigail let out a ragged, shuddering breath, pressing her hands over her face as tears of sheer terror finally spilled over. She cried silently, her shoulders heaving, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. She wasn't just ruined socially. She was hunted. Her father's cold welcome in Leadville suddenly felt like a distant sanctuary she might not survive long enough to reach. Caleb carefully uncocked the Winchester and laid it back across his knees. He reached into his heavy canvas coat and pulled out a battered silver flask, unscrewing the cap. He nudged her elbow. "Drink," he ordered softly. Abigail took the flask with shaking hands and took a sip. The whiskey burned like liquid fire going down her throat, but it shocked her system out of its panic. She handed it back, coughing slightly. "Thank you," she rasped, wiping her eyes with the back of her soiled glove. I owe you my life, Mr. Hayes." "Caleb," he corrected, taking a small pull from the flask himself before putting it away. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You want to tell me how a society girl ends up on a freezing train with a bounty hunter breathing down her neck over a con man's debts?" Abigail looked down at her hands. The shame returned, burning hotter than the whiskey. She had always been taught to keep family matters private, to never air dirty laundry. But looking at the rugged, scarred man who had just risked his life for her, the aristocratic rules of Leadville felt entirely meaningless. "I was a fool," she whispered. And then, slowly, as the train finally lurched forward into the driving snow, Abigail Prescott began to speak. She told him everything about her father's cold ambition, Charles's charming lies, the stolen deed, and the crushing reality of returning home as a disgraced servant in her own house. Caleb listened in complete silence. He didn't offer pity, nor did he offer judgment. When she finally finished, her voice raw and her heart entirely emptied out, she waited for the inevitable look of disgust. Instead, Caleb simply looked out the frosted window at the black silhouettes of the pine trees whipping past. "A man who steals a woman's dowry and runs is a coward," Caleb said slowly. "A woman who realizes her mistake and walks back into the fire to face her father takes grit." He turned his slate-gray eyes back to her. "You ain't ruined, Abigail. You're just starting over. And as for Shaw and his dogs, they'll have to go through me to get to you." For the first time in 6 months, Abigail looked at a man and saw absolute, unvarnished truth. As the train carried them deeper into the treacherous mountains, a strange, undeniable spark ignited between the disgraced heiress and the hardened mountain man, setting the stage for a reckoning that Leadville would never forget. The brutal ascent toward Fremont Pass was a grinding battle of man and machine against the savage fury of the Rocky Mountain winter. The locomotive crawled at a mere walking pace, its smokestack violently spewing cinders into the blinding white oblivion. Inside the rear passenger car, the heavy silence was thick enough to choke on. Abigail remained pressed against Caleb's massive shoulder, drawing strength from the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart beneath the heavy canvas coat. Suddenly, the train lurched violently, the iron wheels screeching against the frozen rails in a shower of sparks. Passengers were thrown forward as the Denver Pacific abruptly ground to a catastrophic halt. The lanterns swinging overhead violently flickered and died, plunging the car into dim, icy twilight. "Avalanche?" someone yelled from the front rows in a panicked pitch. Caleb didn't answer, his jaw clamped tight, the muscles twitching beneath his beard. He shoved the wolf pelt off Abigail and chambered another round into his Winchester with a sharp, terrifying click. "Stay low," he ordered, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Under the bench. Do not come out until I say." Before Abigail could move, the front doors of the car were kicked open. The roaring wind rushed in, carrying with it Thaddeus Shaw, Boyd Higgins, and 2 heavily armed thugs wearing dirty canvas dusters. They had uncoupled the forward cars while the train struggled up the grade, isolating the rear passenger section in the desolate, snow-choked wilderness. "End of the line, trapper!" Shaw bellowed over the howling gale, raising a double-barreled shotgun. "Hand over the girl and we'll let you freeze to death out here with the rest of these dirt scratchers. Fight, and I'll paint this car with your insides." Caleb didn't hesitate. He kicked the heavy wooden bench in front of him upward, creating a makeshift barricade just as Shaw pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the shotgun filled the enclosed space, buckshot tearing through the wood and raining splinters down on Abigail as she scrambled to the freezing floorboards. Caleb returned fire instantly. The Winchester cracked, and the thug standing to Shaw's left crumpled with a scream, clutching his shattered collarbone. The car erupted into total chaos. Passengers screamed, diving under seats and scrambling toward the frozen rear exit. Smoke, thick with the stench of sulfur and burning wool, choked the air. Higgins charged down the aisle, firing wildly with his heavy Colt revolver. One bullet grazed the brim of Caleb's slouch hat. Another embedded itself in the wall inches from his head. Caleb fired back, catching Higgins in the thigh. The barrel-chested thug roared in pain but kept coming, fueled by adrenaline and rage. He threw his massive weight against Caleb's barricade, sending the mountain man crashing backward into the window. The glass shattered. Icy wind blasted into the car. Higgins lunged forward, raising his heavy boot to stomp down on Caleb's chest, while Caleb struggled to bring the long barrel of the Winchester around in the tight quarters. Abigail, trembling beneath the splintered bench, saw Higgins raising his weapon for a killing shot. The aristocratic conditioning that had governed her entire life vanished, replaced by an ancient, desperate survival instinct. She spotted a heavy iron poker lying near the overturned potbelly stove in the center aisle. With a fierce, uncharacteristic cry, Abigail scrambled from her hiding place, grabbed the heavy iron bar with both hands, and swung it with all her remaining strength. The heavy iron connected squarely with the back of Higgins's knee. A sickening crack echoed beneath the gunfire. Higgins roared, his leg giving out as he collapsed sideways. Caleb seized the momentary distraction, drawing his hunting knife and driving the elk antler hilt brutally into Higgins's temple. The thug went limp. Shaw, seeing his men falling, panicked. He raised his shotgun to fire at Abigail, who stood frozen over Higgins's body. "No!" Caleb bellowed. He lunged across the aisle, throwing his massive body between Abigail and the bounty hunter just as the second barrel discharged. Caleb grunted, a spray of blood misting the air as the buckshot tore into his upper shoulder. The force spun him around, but he remained on his feet long enough to snap his Colt revolver from his hip and fire a single dead-center shot. Shaw's eyes went wide. The shotgun slipped from his hands, and he crashed backward through the heavy wooden door, tumbling out into the raging blizzard. The remaining thug took one look at Shaw, dropped his weapon, and fled into the storm. Silence rapidly descended on the bullet-riddled car, broken only by the wailing of the terrified passengers and the shriek of the wind. Abigail dropped the iron poker, her hands shaking violently. She rushed to Caleb, who had slumped back against the splintered wall, his left hand clutching his bleeding shoulder. "You're hurt," she cried, tearing the fabric of her ruined traveling dress to press against the wound. Caleb winced, but a faint, exhausted smirk touched the corners of his mouth. He looked up at her, his slate-gray eyes entirely devoid of their usual hardened guard. "Remind me," he breathed heavily, "never to cross a Leadville society girl." By the time a rescue engine reached them from the summit and pulled the battered car into Leadville, the blizzard had broken, revealing a sharp, brilliantly clear winter morning. The bustling mining town was a chaotic sea of horse-drawn sleighs, smoking chimneys, and shouting miners. Caleb's wound had been tightly bound by Abigail. He refused a doctor, insisting on walking her to her final destination. Together, the disgraced heiress and the bleeding mountain man walked the icy boardwalks toward the elite upper crust of Harrison Avenue. Judge William Prescott's mansion stood like a fortress of dark Victorian brick, sneering down at the muddy streets below. Abigail's steps slowed as they approached the wrought iron gates. The sheer terror of her father's judgment threatened to break the resolve she had found on the train. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said quietly, standing tall beside her despite his injury. "I have to face him," Abigail whispered. "It is my debt." When the heavy oak doors opened, Judge Prescott stood in the foyer. He was a tall, severe man with cold eyes and a heart forged from Leadville silver. He looked at his daughter's ruined dress, her bruised face, and the blood-stained mountain man standing beside her, and his lip curled in absolute disgust. "You look exactly like the gutter you chose to sleep in, Abigail," the judge sneered. "I told you in the telegram, the servants' entrance is around the back. You will scrub the floors until you have earned back every dime that charlatans stole from my estate." Abigail swallowed hard, the familiar crushing weight of her father's authority bearing down on her. She took a step toward the servants' hall. Caleb's massive hand caught hers. He gently pulled her back. "She ain't scrubbing a single floor in this tomb," Caleb rumbled, stepping forward to meet the judge's icy stare. Judge Prescott bristled. "Remove your filthy hands from my daughter, you uncivilized brute, before I have the sheriff hang you for trespassing." "Sheriff Davies is a good friend of mine," Caleb replied evenly. "And he knows damn well that Caleb Hayes of the Whispering Pines Ranch doesn't take orders from corrupt judges who treat their own kin like indentured slaves." The judge faltered, his eyes widening. Whispering Pines was the largest, most prosperous cattle operation in the entire valley. The man standing before him was no penniless drifter. He was one of the wealthiest landowners in the territory, choosing a life of solitude over society parlors. Caleb turned to Abigail, ignoring the sputtering judge. "You paid your debt, Abigail. You faced your mistakes. You survived a train car full of killers, and you saved my life. You don't belong in the dark, scrubbing floors for a man who doesn't see your worth." He reached up, gently brushing a stray lock of soot-stained hair from her face. "Come with me, to the ranch. It ain't a mansion, but the fires are warm, the skies are wide, and nobody will ever look down on you again." Abigail looked back at her father, seeing only a bitter, lonely old man trapped in a house of cold, dead things. Then she looked at Caleb, scarred, bleeding, fiercely protective, and undeniably true. The choice wasn't a choice at all. "I would like that very much," she said, a genuine smile breaking through her exhaustion. Without another word to the judge, Abigail turned her back on her former life. She walked out into the brilliant mountain sunlight with her hand firmly in Caleb's, stepping away from the shadows of shame and into the wild, untamed promise of the frontier. And so, Abigail traded a life of gilded cages and bitter shame for the boundless freedom of the frontier, proving that true wealth lies in courage, and true love can be found in the most unexpected places. If you enjoyed this Wild West